So what we're going to do is kick things off first with Barr Weiner. Barr, maybe if you could be working your way up here. I'd just like to introduce, you don't need to run. I'd just like to introduce Barr. Barr's going to talk, we have an hour and a half slotted. Barr says that he's got about 5 minutes of remarks. And he's hoping that you have a lot of questions. He's kidding a little bit. But we do hope that you have a lot of questions, both in the room and virtually. So we're going to start with Barr, and I want to get your title right, Barr. Associate Director for Policy and Product Classification Officer in the Office of Combination Products. Barr is one of the leading policy people when it comes to combination products. And I would also say personally, he's extremely accessible and helpful. And so if you don't get your questions answered as a part of the general discussion, or maybe it's a topic you're not comfortable talking about in public, I would encourage you to reach out to Barr more privately. So with that, Barr, may I give it over to you? And you probably use that microphone over there and drive your PowerPoint.
Thank you very much, Brad. Just want to make sure that this sound, can I close up the mics to be working all right? I'm not known for being the easiest person to understand when I talk, so I'll make sure this is okay. Anyway, well, thank you very much. Just continuing the thanks, I wanted to thank RAPS and CPC for putting together this third CGMP event with FDA over the past several years. We agree they're very productive. It's a unique opportunity for us as well to really have a chance to sort of see if people are kind of getting what we're writing and having a chance to hear some questions and see if what we're saying makes sense to people who actually have to implement it. It's sort of a nice variation on the much more abstracted kind of dialogue you have through a draft guidance followed by written comments followed by a final written document. So we really do appreciate that. And in keeping with that, I want to thank everybody in the room and online for participating, because we really are looking forward to the input we'll get from all of you today from our perspective. So with that, let me just begin the talk. Excellent. This is just the basic outline. Oh, before I start, I should note, by the way, just in sort of tongue-in-cheek, but also to be clear, we did in fact extend the comment period, but it wasn't just for this group. Anyway, so this is the outline for my presentation, and then the overall plan for this session is, once I finish talking, which will be as soon as possible. Is there kind of a buzz? Is that all right? I don't know if that's an issue. Should I keep going? That's okay. Okay. Anyway, so once I finish this sort of formal presentation, the team will be up here. The people who actually know what we're talking about, who actually do the GMP work for FDA, and they may have some additional remarks on top of the formal slide deck. And in any event, there'll be a time for the Q&A for any questions you've had in light of the slides or otherwise about the issues before the scenarios start. So here's the background, the rule, the draft guidance, which will be the bulk of the presentation, and then some brief discussion about next steps. So first, yet another round of thanks. I think this is really an important slide for a lot of reasons to get some perspective on this process, but this is the ever-growing list of people who've been involved with this working group since I got involved. There was a working group before I came to OCP, so I don't even know who was on that working group, but it just keeps growing. And these are just the folks who've been actually in the staff-level working group to develop the rule and then the guidance. This doesn't include their supervisors, other experts, other people from senior staff in the commissioner's office, from the chief counsel's office. It really is a remarkably complicated process, which is just worth bearing in mind if you wonder why it takes so long. So thanks. By way of background, this is just really basic background to make sure we're all on the same page if anybody here is not that familiar with combination products. So first question, what is a combination product? And then what kinds there are, et cetera. So combination products, as I'm sure most of you know, are products that combine two or more kinds of medical products. It has to be different medical products. It can't be a drug and a drug, but a drug and a device, a biologic and a drug, biologic and a device, et cetera. And there are three kinds in the U.S. There's what we call single-entity combination products, which are things like prefilled syringes, drug-eluting stents, transdermal patches, et cetera. Co-packages, which is basically anything that's kitted that meets the combination product characteristic. More on that, I think, in the scenarios. And then the third, which is, I think, the most bizarre, at least, or I should say, at least the most unique, or the only unique to the U.S., is the cross-labeled category. And and that is basically where you've got products that are distributed separately, but by right of how they're labeled with relation to each other and how they're studied, among other things, they are considered combination products as well, because they're sort of intimately bound. That's a confusing category, but doesn't have a huge now significance for CGMPs, so if it sounds confusing, don't have to worry too much about it for today. Biological products is also, of course, a major issue for this rule, and it's just important to bear in mind for them the basic legal principle, which is that they're always either a drug or device as well as a biological product under U.S. law, and that's how you get them into the main system of regulation at FDA. HCTPs can be drugs, devices, biologics, depends upon how they need to be regulated, but that's a distinct category as well. And then the last point here is that the requirements for drugs, devices, biologics, HCTPs all apply to combination products that include those kinds of constituent parts. And of course, what the rule's about, explaining how to comply with them. Oh, I should also note here, I don't want to be too complicated since we're doing a webcast, but if anything here is confusing or you can't hear what I said or whatever it is, if you want to raise your hand, we can try to at least clarify things in real time to make sure we're all on the same page. Okay, so the rule. Basic issue here was you have the rules for the underlying constituent parts of combination products, but nothing that really explains how you should apply them to a combination product, so that's what the final rule is about, trying to make sure that you could kind of clarify how you apply them and also try to make sure that we were offering a way to comply with them that was as efficient as well as effective as possible, so avoiding redundancies and that sort of thing. For cross-labeled combination products, the rule is really pretty straightforward. You simply look at the requirements for the constituent part, and that's it. So if it's a device being manufactured by itself, then you do QSR. If it's a drug, you do 210, 211. It's not terribly complicated. The more interesting aspect is for co-packaged and single-entity combination products, and that's where this streamlined approach that we developed and published kicks in. So under the streamlined approach, essentially, you can pick, and it's up to you which one you pick. You can pick either to have a 211 base, 210, 211 base, or an 820 QSR base for your operating system for your manufacturing facility, and then whichever one you pick, you have to augment with systems to demonstrate compliance with specified provisions from the other rule that is not your base. So if you pick QSRs, and you've got called out provisions from 211. If you pick 211, you've got called out provisions from the QSR you have to comply with. If you do all that and you demonstrate compliance with that base set of rules, that base set of requirements, and the specified provisions, we consider that demonstrating compliance with those sets of rules. In addition, if you have a biologic or HCTP in your product, you have to comply with the requirements for those as well. So that's the rule in a nutshell. I'm assuming that's pretty clear to everybody, but just in case. And the call-out provisions, just so we have them handy, these are the 820 call-outs. I'll be coming back to this a bit more in relationship to the draft guidance. But as you can see, they're basically focusing on things that are either peculiar to devices or that just aren't as precisely or fully developed in the 211 system. So, design control is traditionally thought of as more of a device requirement, although there's certainly parallel concepts in the drug world. Installation servicing, obviously very device-oriented. But other things are just more detailed. Purchasing controls is something you worry about in drugs as well. CAPA, well-established in drugs. Management responsibility, especially by statute now, is pretty well-established for drugs too, but not as developed in terms of regulatory language. In contrast, to some extent, if you look at the drug call-outs on this slide, you're looking at things that basically are really drug-specific by and large, things you just wouldn't usually do for a device, yield issues, release testing, special testing requirements, etc. But there are issues here, I'll come back to this later, that implicate the device constituent part, and that's one of the things that's probably worth being clear about. We tried to clarify in the draft guidance. So the draft guidance, while we're here today. So I want to talk about a couple things. First of all, kind of how we got here and where we're planning to go. Yes. Okay. Turn this off or something. Nice. Am I good? You're good. Okay. So is there any indication from the phone that people couldn't hear so far because of the mics? To actually clarify, or are we good? They've been okay. Just trying to tighten it up there. Okay. Terrific. All right, so history and process, kind of how we got here, where we're planning to go, and then the content of the draft guidance itself, and that's the bulk of the presentation. So history, one when we prepared the proposed rule, one of the main comments we got on it was we need more guidance. This is great. We think your idea is pretty good, but we don't really know exactly what we're talking about. We need a lot more details. So we heard that, and we first of all tried to provide fairly detailed discussion in the preamble to the final rule, so at least that was out as a starting point. But we also recognized that even if we could, we didn't want to put too much guidance in there because that thing's sort of set in concrete. Anything you say there is really hard to change because it's confusing to the public because it stays in place forever. Whereas guidance is you can modify and replace and revise. So we tried to keep it at a certain level of generality and try to be sure we were really quite confident in what we were saying, that we weren't going to change our mind on that in the future. Which left the issue of actually developing the guidance itself. In terms of timelines, referring back to that thanks slide from the beginning, we started working on that draft guidance before we even published the final rule. So we really have been working on it for a while. It just took a while to put it together. But we were mindful that it should get out as soon as possible. So we tried to start as soon as we had the rule stable internally. But even having done that, it still took us forever to get it out, which is largely a matter of both the challenges of coordination and thinking things through for all the different components that needed to be involved, from the centers and from ORA and our office, chief counsel, et cetera. And also just the clearance process is a royal pain for this kind of stuff at FDA, just FYI. It takes a long time. I think largely driven by resource considerations. You have to have a certain priority to kind of keep things moving, and your priority can shift. And frankly, I think it helped when we got a couple letters in from industry saying, where's our guidance? We need our guidance. So we actually responded. I think one of the letters was to the commissioner herself, and she replied back and said, well, it's a priority for this year, last year. And consistent with that, we actually got it out not last year, which is ridiculous, but we got it out. We did get it out in January, which is pretty good. Anyways, the goal of the guidance was simply to provide practical, substantive information, and that's hopefully what we did. So next steps, we're trying to get the final guidance done as soon as we can. Obviously, we're not done with that yet since we haven't gotten the comments, but we're trying to think things through even on our end in light of what we're hearing informally and working through issues so we can try to have a good jump start on things as we start reviewing the comments when they start piling up by the deadline. And I should note in that regard, since we're talking about preparing comments after this meeting, if you're not done with yours yet, so to speak, we really are looking forward to getting as many comments as we can get. We're not shy of reviewing things. We've got plenty of people to take a look. But if you can tell your folks, and if you're writing them yourselves, please just be as precise and practical as you can. I'm anticipating certain areas where we're a little bit vague because we weren't quite sure we could be more specific without facts, where you might want more detail or you might want some examples, that kind of thing. But recognizing kind of what we're working from in terms of what the base requirements are for the underlying products and kind of going from there would be constructive for us all, and just trying to be clear would be really appreciated. And as Brad mentioned, the deadline's the 29th of this month. So I just realized I should have done some sort of April Fools in this presentation. Anyway, content. This is just the first cut on the content stuff. So first thing, this is the general guidance. I guess that's clear to everybody. But I want to emphasize that point because I'm guessing a lot of the, I won't say frustration, but a lot of the interest from industry will be about your particular kind of product and how is this applying to you, getting down to the getting more granular. I appreciate that. We all appreciate that. But we can't do too much about that in the general guidance. It's 200 pages long. So in terms of your comments, if there's here today or in terms of written comments, if there's particular categories you really think this is a big marketed space, we need a lot more detail for it, that's a great comment. What that probably means is that we're going to be reading that as saying we should develop some additional some related guidance on particular product categories and particular issues rather than having a huge new development in this guidance. So just in terms of timelines, you might want to bear that in mind. But it would be helpful to hear that. And also in terms of reviewing the guidance, part of why it's broad is because it's broad. The other reason it's broad, though, I wanted to point out was that we're not really talking about all the issues here can't be resolved abstractly, as you know. A lot of things are fact dependent. So when you see places in the draft, at least, where we've said things like, if you have questions, call us, it's not just because we're being nice, and it's not just because the guidance is a bit broad, but because we anticipate that's probably going to be the way we need to work with those issues. That they're going to be fact specific, and to get to much more detail, you probably need to talk about your particular product with us to work it through. Last point, this is, of course, a draft document. I want to be really clear about this in a presentation like this. So the rest of this presentation is presenting what that draft says. I'm not presenting policy. I'm not presenting my views. I'm simply telling you what the draft guidance says. So it's not final. So structure and overview. this is basically how the guidance is put together if you haven't had a chance to look at it yet. We got sort of background discussion about the rule and related issues, general considerations of applying or complying with Part 4, the rule, and then a lot of discussion about the particular called-out provisions from the 211s and 820s in particular. So general points. As I mentioned earlier, the first thing we want to really drive home, because there's been some confusion about this, even in expert groups I've been involved with, for the rule, which is that it's up to you. If you want to do a streamlined approach, you decide which one you want to do. It doesn't matter what your application type is. It doesn't matter what the primary mode of action of your product is. It's up to you. If you think it makes better sense as a business matter to go one way or the other, that's great. In terms of interacting with FDA, as for most combination product issues, first step is to contact your lead center with any questions. If you think combination products could be of help, we're happy to engage. If you're not really sure who to contact, you can reach out to us to figure that out too. But those are sort of your two kind of key points. But that doesn't mean you're not going to be talking to other people in the agency. It just means that those are kind of good kind of gates to go through to kind of get to the right people, make sure you're getting good information from the right folks at other centers, at ORA, what have you. Of course, there's some issues will be coming through the field and whatnot, so we're not sort of recommending that you change your general practices for a given facility issue. But for sort of policy questions, bigger questions, presidential questions, start with the lead center or come to us if you need to. Demonstrating compliance, I think this is pretty straightforward, but since there are a lot of questions about it, for the rulemaking, we try to emphasize it in the guidance. There's nothing new here. You simply have to demonstrate the way we'd expect you to demonstrate for any non-combination product. And related to that, when we inspect, we're inspecting on the same basis with the sort of same approach. At least that's what we're trying to do, regardless of what sort of system you set up, whether it's a streamlined system, a non-streamlined system, what kind of streamlined system. We just want to sort of see, that your system is compliant. You can approach it in all those different ways and still be compliant, but the basic questions we're worrying about remain the same. Investigational products, key message I thought from here. Let me step back for 1 second. All these discussions on the specified provisions and general content of the guidance, I'm just kind of pulling out things I thought were interesting. So there's other stuff in here. This isn't a shorthand for what you should take away from the guidance. These are the things I thought might be of interest and of concern. And actually, I was hoping it'd be interesting to contrast with Brian's presentation to sort of see if we're actually identifying similar issues or totally different issues, but we'll see. Anyway, so investigational products, the thing I thought was interesting was just that the exemptions that apply to drugs and devices apply to the combination product too. It doesn't matter whether you're under an IND or an IDE, they all apply. So just kind of good to know. Okay, devices and container closures. I think this is something that kind of gets touched on in the scenarios. We definitely heard some comments about this issue. We tried to take a run at it in the draft guidance. I'm curious to see what the comments will be on this discussion. But the basic messages are twofold, at least to me. One is that the way you get to have 820 obligations for a combination product is because there are 820 obligations for the device. So you need to kind of analyze your device closely if you think it's ambiguous as to whether it would really have 820 issues in the context of the combination product. It may be that you've got something that wouldn't be subject to 820 on its own, but now you're folding it into a new environment, so to speak, and in that context for that use, it has new characteristics which may change its status as a device. And we didn't give a lot of explanation of how to do that analysis in here, just to be clear, but that analysis, I think, needs to be done for you to make that determination. Once you've made that determination, that guides whether you actually have 820 requirements for a combination product or not. So that's the first thing. And it's really more, and it's an issue just because there are some very basic devices that are used in the context of container closures, and what kind of duties you might have for them really may be ambiguous to you. And we gave a couple of examples in the guidance to give you a flavor of at least our thinking on it. In terms of container closure requirements, I guess this is probably pretty obvious, but when you take a device and you fill it and it becomes a container closure, it's a container closure. So the thing we tried to drive home was that you are essentially both the device and a container closure, so to speak, or that container closure requirements from 21184 apply to you as well as device considerations because you're now essentially a drug component or drug container closure. Convenience kits, and we'll talk more about this today, so I won't spend a lot of time on this, but the key thing here to bear in mind is we've defined the term in the draft guidance. We actually had already defined it in the preamble to the final rules, so that definition is pretty stable as a kind of a safe haven, I guess I would say, where if you really stay within the bounds of that precise definition, which basically says the stuff you're putting in the kit is already got a marketing authorization, it's coming in as packaged for that separate marketing authorization and distribution, it's got all the labeling as if it was being marketed separately. You're not changing its uses, nothing's changing, you're just taking the box and putting it into a bigger box. then that's a convenience kit. And if you have a convenience kit, the only CGMP requirements you really need to worry about are those for the kitting process, assembling, packaging, labeling, etc. If you're not a convenience kit, analysis shifts. So you need to be clear about the facts. Application holders, combination product manufacturers, constituent part and component manufacturers. We had a lot of comments on this, on the proposed rule. We tried to kind of talk through some of the relationship issues here in the draft guidance. Basic point being that there's meaningfully distinct duties and roles that are particularly, I think, complicated to think through sometimes for combination products as compared to non-combination products, because you've got different facilities involved and may have wholly different kind of systems in place and aren't used to thinking about the other systems and are scared of thinking about the other systems and don't want to think about the other requirements. So we tried to kind of break this down. This is also in the preamble a bit to the rule, but component manufacturers, there's nothing new here. If you didn't have requirements to be under CGMP before, you don't have duties now. If you did, as a drug manufacturer, for example, for API, say, you still do. But the constituent, statutory duties, but the combination product manufacturer needs to worry about the whole scheme as presented in Part 4. And if you're not the true manufacturer in the sense of actually running the facility, but you're the sponsor and you've got contract facilities, you've got duties too. I was relieved to see, frankly, there was really no ambiguity about that when we met for the final rule with the same setup with RAPS and CPC a couple of years ago, that no one seemed to really question that notion that if you're the sponsor, you're responsible for your product and you need to own it, you need to know it's being made properly and oversee the process as a consequence. So that's basically the flavor of this slide. Change controls. There's a specific discussion of change control issues in the draft guidance, probably because we got questions about it. I think the main thing here kind of relates back to what I was just saying, which is that when you're making changes to your own product, obviously you need to kind of follow CGMP requirements, including design control requirements for that. But also, in terms of oversight issues, whether you're a facility, manufacturer who has a facility or the sponsor or both, knowing what's going on with your product is really important, obviously. And if the folks who are supplying you are making changes, you need to know about them. And if you can't know everything you want to know about them because they won't tell you, which we recognize happens, it's reflected in the regulations, you need some plan to figure out how you're going to manage that situation. So planning for change, both in terms of whether you want to make a change or whether someone's making a change you're going to have to manage, is something we were trying to emphasize as an important issue. Probably most complicated in the context of cross-label combination products, by the way, but just because you may have a wholly separate sponsor with a different product and you're trying to work together, and that can get very messy, but important in all contexts. Specified requirements. Okay, this is where the bulk of the draft guidance is focused, and basically it focuses primarily on the 210 and 211 and the 820 requirements and how to incorporate them into a base system. This slide, I just want to emphasize a couple of things. First point is that in some context, we couldn't walk through these, each requirement in, infinite detail. So we tried to focus on what we thought was the most practical way in. So while there's general discussion of what these requirements, what they call the provisions require, which I think is, fairly comprehensive in summary form, the way into them has really been more on the assumption that you're really working with those requirements as specified requirements being added to a base system under the other rule. So there are situations where you need to read these rules, these requirements more broadly because they're all you got. You've got 211 system. You don't have 820. You don't have all the 820 requirements applying to you on a streamlined approach. You're basically having to read the 211s in light of 820 considerations essentially, and vice versa for your base. So we didn't get into that kind of complexity in the guidance. That's obviously an issue to think about. The other thing was in terms of how to kind of apply the base and the specified requirements. We're trying to think in terms of working. Well, actually, this is a different slide. Wait 1 second. Yeah, that's right. So they still fit together. You've got. I'll give an example here of 82080 and 21184. The requirements from the 820s and 211s the idea is that they kind of relate to each other. They kind of overlap. They're somewhat synergistic. That's part of why we thought the streamlined approach would work. So when you're setting up a system, we were trying to emphasize through at least some examples and things in the draft guidance that you should think about it holistically. How do you kind of get these requirements fitted into the base system in a way that makes sense and augments and enhances and streamlines as well. Last point is as I kind of said for the general presentation already, for these called out provisions, I've emphasized a few things I thought were interesting, but that doesn't mean to say that they're the most important thing there. There's things that struck me as probably worth highlighting for discussion. So 820 duties. First point we've kind of made in the draft was that there's a lot of overlap here. as I said earlier on the talk, a significant distinction is really just that for a lot of the requirements, the 820s are more detailed than 211s, but the duties still may arise either from the 211s or from the statute for drugs as well. And even if they don't have exactly the same duties, at least my understanding, and you can correct me if you disagree, but my impression from talking to all of you over the last few years and from my colleagues is that the actual CGMP of most manufacturers in the drug world is pretty close to a lot of the expectations that are reflected in the 820s at this point for the called-up provisions. So there's not a lot of new stuff here. So this, I think, is more of a fear factor of being sure you're fully demonstrating compliance, even though you kind of have the idea. So we kind of have that. We wanted to kind of make that clear that you probably have a lot in place already. You're kind of trying to just confirm it, build on it, that kind of thing. That said, however similar they may be, the fact is Part 4 is making it clear that you've got to comply with the actual letter of the law for all those specified provisions. So you need to look at them closely and make sure you're actually complying with the detail. So for management responsibility, for example, you're talking about all the duties for the executives that they actually are doing what they're supposed to be doing themselves, that kind of thing. Purchasing controls, all the specific expectations for purchasing agreements and control of your suppliers and that kind of thing. You need to actually do what the regulation expressly says. Design control. Okay, this is probably one of the two big issues with the rule from what we've been saying. I'm sure we'll talk a lot more about this today. But I just want to talk about a couple basic points. First of all, as reflected in the preamble to the rule, so this is established policy, it applies to the combination product. Second point, it only concerns the combination product, which is sort of the good news in a sense. So we address this in part through examples in the draft guidance, but the point here is that, and we actually address it in the preamble as well, but the point is that when you think about what sort of design, what you need to kind of match the design for in terms of being compliant with 820, you're just talking about the combination product. So things are being brought into the combination product that are fully developed and good to go. We're not telling you to go back and somehow recreate how you develop that drug or that device. That's not the point. The point is when you bring them together to make a combination product, what issues are there in making that combination product? So if there's some novelty to both the drug and the device, for example, there'll be design controls considerations for both of them. If the novelty really is only in relation to one of them, then the other is essentially an input for design control. Last general point is I feel we got the sense that people were a bit anxious about how to manage record keeping for design control. And want to be clear that you can cross-reference as long as we can understand where things are and you can get them to us in a reasonable amount of time. We're fine. So if you want to cross-reference to NDA files or 510Ks or whatever it might be that you think is where you want to have things residing for your purposes ordinarily, as long as that cross-reference is clear and you can pull it from there if we need to take a look at it, we're fine. Okay, moving on to other issues. 2 points. The first, I hope, is pretty obvious. If you're going to comply with design control, you need to comply with the requirements of the regulation, which means you need to basically have a system that demonstrates compliance with each step of design control under 82030. This lists out the different steps. I think that part's pretty straightforward. A related point is we don't really care about the terminology. You may have a system that's been around for years that does everything you're supposed to do, but you haven't been using these words because you didn't think of yourself as a device manufacturer. We don't really care about the words, we care about the substance. As long as you can tell us where it is and explain it to us, and we can review it, we're fine. But you need to make sure that you actually have something that hits all these different buckets. So do you have a plan? Have you had the meetings? Have you got all the steps? Have you got the testing, et cetera? Now that said, we've got this concept of a legacy product that folks have been asking us about for a while. I think the first comment on that is that, broadly speaking, we don't really recognize the concept of the legacy product, just to be clear. We think that these products were, unless you're kind of a pre-96 product, in which case design control didn't apply to you when you were developing your product, you had a duty to be in compliance because the combination product, contract was in place by 96, and we thought these requirements applied to combination products before the rules even published, and that's reflected among other places in the draft guidance that's now been replaced by this draft guidance that came out in 2004. So we don't think this is fundamentally new. That said, we did say in the preamble that we would work with industry. If you weren't quite sure what you were doing and you had questions, you can come talk to us. If we see a problem, our first reaction was not going to be to ding you, it would be to work with you, unless there's really a public health concern that forces more dramatic action. So if you're worried and you're not sure you're in compliance, it's not a bad idea, especially in this context, to come ask us what we think, because this is your chance. Especially when there's not even a final guidance in place, we recognize that our policy positions aren't entirely transparent, so we want to give you a chance to work with us to resolve issues. In addition, in the draft guidance, we proposed an approach to how to address situations where you think you're not sure you're in compliance with design control. And this second bullet on this slide walks through the issue. So the idea is what we're recommending, in the draft at least, is that you look for the gaps, if there are any gaps. Do you actually have something you think hits all the different buckets under the first bullet here? If so, terrific. If not, what can you do about it, or we make sure you're demonstrating compliance with the expectations of that requirement? You may need to do some augmenting to comply with the different pieces, but our assumption is an awful lot of it will already be there, because frankly, if you've been approved under a BLA or an NDA, you've got to have pretty significant safety and effectiveness data, for example. So a lot of the underlying theory for why you need this should have been addressed somehow. In addition, we recognize there are things it would make no sense for you to do it after the fact. So if there's sort of steps you didn't take, like having a plan for your design control for that product, because you didn't have a design control paradigm for the product, there's no point in creating a plan now. It's done. Now you just need to actually have the system in place. Similarly, if you didn't have design review meetings, having a meeting after you've already done the design doesn't make a lot of sense. Those need to be elements of your going forward design control management for that product, but you don't need to have a retrospective approach to those considerations. So we can talk more about this bullet if you like in the Q&A, but it pretty much captures what the draft guidance says. Installation and servicing, just wanted to flag that this shouldn't come up very much in the single entity or co-packaged combination product context, and the draft guidance says as much. I guess the way I see it is it was put into the rule basically because we thought it might come up. We wanted to be clear that you had to comply with it if it did come up. But it's really an issue that's probably more likely to come up for cross-label combination products that actually have a durable device. Okay, the 211 duties. A few things here. The first basic point I wanted to make was that as I mentioned before, the duties here are basically about the drug, by and large. But even though they're kind of about the drug, they need to take into account the device or other constituent parts as appropriate to make sure you're addressing the needs for the drug. So, for example, container closure requirements obviously are drug container closure requirements, but but they apply to the device constituent part if it's a container closure, so it applies to the device. Similarly, reserve samples are about reserving samples of the drug to make sure you can test them as needed on all the products in the market, but you need to include whatever touches the drug. So that may be the device, may be part of the drug, may be part of the device, etc. Also for testing, release, stability, special testing, we've explained in draft guidance, thinking on requirements to do the testing on the single entity combination product, on the whole combination product if it's single entity. But if it's co-packaged, then maybe you can just focus on the drug because the device, again, is not what we're worrying about, and it's not actually part of the thing that needs to be tested. So you just need to kind of go through that analysis is the point of this slide. Calculation of yield. The main thing I've been hearing about from folks, I thought I'd just flag here, was the issue that being clear that at least in our view in the draft, well, actually, this is basically from the regulation, but the notion that you need to do the testing at each phase where there might be loss, basically. So, and that can go through the entire process all the way through packaging. So you need to do the analysis when you think it could occur, but it's not just a question for the drug constituent part before you transition to manufacture of the combination product. Tamper-emitted packaging is an OTC issue in case people were wondering if they actually had a duty. If you make prescription drugs, it's not your problem. And then in terms of how to comply with it, one thing we said which was novel, I think, in terms of, at least in writing in the draft guidance, was that we didn't see any reason why you couldn't comply with it by just putting tamper-evident packaging around the drug inside the co-package rather than trying to do it for both. Expiration dating must be on the labeling. And that's an interesting point, by the way, because that raises questions for kitting. How do you make sure that all the expiration dates for what's in the kit are available to the purchaser when the box is closed for sale? And then also that this isn't, although it's a requirement again about the expiration fundamentally of the drug, this one really is needs to be more broadly considered because there's a date for the product, so you need to think about any shelf life issues for the device as well. In some cases, it might be shorter than the drug, although that's probably not a frequent scenario. Testing and release, not much on this. I just wanted to emphasize the issue about doing it on every batch, because this issue of lots and batches and making sure you're doing things for each lot or each batch on the 211s is something we've been getting some, I think, angst about from industry. But basically, the theory for combination products is that we need to have the same specificity in terms of relating testing to particular batches to be able to control by the batch, by the lot, as we would for a drug. The second bullet here is just an FYI. I thought it was interesting to just read. I'm not sure it's the most beautifully crafted footnote, frankly, but it's an interesting issue because in the footnote to that section we talk about in-process release, since of course 211 and 165 is about final release. and tried to kind of walk you through at least our thinking, or our proposed thinking, I guess I should say, on how to approach resolving a question where you don't have a 211 requirement applicable to you, but you need to think about how to apply the 820s, to the drug. How do you handle in-process release? And we pointed to how to relate the 820s to 211 requirements, and how you might look at the 211 requirements as sort of as a way to kind of think about the 820 requirements, and we look at the guidance as to kind of give yourself a flavor for what you might be trying to accomplish. Stability testing. Main thing I thought was want to emphasize there was just that you're talking about testing in the combination product. So you're not talking about doing stability testing on the drug that comes in and then you're done. That's not what you need to know about. You need to know about what you're actually marketing. And for special testing, there's more in this section than this, but the thing I thought was probably most interesting to folks is that, of course, controlled release means controlled release. So whatever products have controlled release are covered, and the draft includes in that, by way of example, drug-eluting stents and transdermal patches. Reserve samples, I think this and device and design control are probably the two things we've been hearing the most questions about, this being essentially an economic issue. The draft guidance basis walks through the requirements and tries to at least be clear, as I mentioned before, that you don't have to include any more of the device than you need to because it touches the drug, although you may need to have a sample of the device standing around so you can actually test the drug properly for an auto-injector system, for example, or something like that. So that's sort of, I guess, the good news. You're not talking about having to have, dialysis machines sitting on the shelf or something, but you do need to have whatever touches the drug. We recognize there's a lot of questions on this topic, and this is an example where I was saying before that we put into the guidance, contact us with your questions, because I'm not really sure we're going to end up being able to say a whole heck of a lot more in a general guidance on this, because I think it's going to be really fact-dependent what situations would justify any kind of special treatment. One thing I can tell you is that it's rare that we would kind of give some kind of waiver to anything. And secondly, that we have been talking with companies a bit about the idea of trying to tighten up controls as a way to kind of avoid having to have as many samples. Obviously, tighter controls mean more cost as well, and we've been hearing kind of mixed reactions to that, but that is something we've been thinking about on our end if you're interested in talking to us about. It's one thing that's come up a few times. Biological products and HCTPs, just wanted to flag the basic points. The issue with biological CGMPs is they augment the underlying drug device CGMPs to address biologics issues, so that's why you have to comply with everything in that context. That's what the draft guidance says. And for HCTPs, a similar analysis, it has the good CGT. Anyway, the testing requirements for those are basically focused on communicable disease, which is a peculiar issue for HCTPs. But in contrast with the biological CGP requirements, the issue here isn't that they're wholly distinct and augmenting, they're just different. And there are ways that you can be showing compliance through 211 and 820 compliance, and that's addressed in guidance by FDA, but we figure that's really an issue that's better addressed through guidance and clarified there because it's again, a fact-specific analysis, and it's not a one-size-fits-all that you could really accomplish through regulatory language. So next steps. Obviously, submission of comments, preparing the final guidance. We said we're trying to do that as soon as we can. While we're in this stage, especially the draft guidance being in process and don't have a final guidance out, especially in this context, if you have questions for your product, we really do encourage you to come talk to us, because we recognize you may be a bit confused about what our thinking is, because you don't have anything in writing about it for certain issues, and we don't want to have that dynamic complicating things for you or for us. So better to come and ask questions. We can work through it with you than have us have to kind of manage it on the fly during the inspection. This is just resources, copies of the rules, and of the web pages for getting the CGMP requirements for drugs, devices, and biologics, and contact information for me. So thank you very much, and I'm going to ask the other FDA folks to come on up in case we have something to add or for the Q&A session now.